Hello, brothers and sisters. Let me address some interesting things about language. Um, Prank call. Anybody ever made this prank call? Hello, my name is Ethan. I just wanted to call and let you know that your refrigerator is running. And they say, "Oh, yeah, really? Well, you better catch it." That's verbal wordplay, right? There's a double meaning of the word running. Obviously, running is meant uh, in regard to refrigeration in terms of its proper use. The electricity is running, the the uh, the compressor is running, everything is working. So what the nuance is working, but we're using a wordplay, a double meaning, to make a joke, right? That it's literally running. No one pictures a refrigerator running. So which one of those nuances is meant is determined by context. So we're going to look at a little bit of wordplay with verbs in the book of Jonah, and we're going to take a look at some translations that kind of follow that wordplay in a way that's a little easier than some other translations. So it's always good to try to mix up your translations to see what kind of patterns you see or repetitions you see and see if that actually sheds light a little bit more on in personifying the story and bringing out a theological meaning or a contrast or surprises. So let's take a look at a few of those. All right, let's take a look at some of the wordplay associated with Jonah's movement in the book of Jonah. So I selected the King James Version because um, they sometimes will try to go with the main sense of a Hebrew root. So, like, and when sometimes English, it makes more sense to say someone went somewhere or they got up or they stood. I noticed that in their translation of Jonah, they're pretty consistent about translating the same verbal root in a way that conveys kind of this directional movement that the author is using to display kind of a theme in Jonah with the use of his movement. So we're going to look at going up and going down. So yeah, the first instruction to Jonah from the Lord is arise. This comes from the Hebrew root kum. It's a command. Get up, rise. That is the action he's supposed to do. As we see in his response, he does rise to flee. So, yeah, those words are back to back in the Hebrew. And he rose, Jonah rose to flee. And so Jonah is going up, and then this is interesting a theme, some wordplay with the verb that we see. Jonah goes down, and we'll see how far exactly Jonah sinks. So he flees from the presence of the Lord, and the next word, the next verb is that he does is he goes down to Joppa. So this is interesting use of it, right? And geographically, we can see that Joppa is south of Israel. So he does go down. If you see where Nineveh is, Joppa is south of Israel. Israel, northern kingdom. He would be about right here, in Samaria area, maybe up here a little bit. And he was supposed to go up to Nineveh. Instead, Jonah goes down to Joppa. So yeah, it makes sense that the narrator would choose down, right? If we think of the world as north, south, up, down. But it is interesting going down to Joppa. Now, probably a decrease in elevation as it's by the coast as well. But is this a theme that the author is choosing to develop? He goes down to Joppa. So let's continue reading along. He found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare thereof and went down into it. So we have him descending again to go with him unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. A repetition there, reminding us of the consequence here. And I picked a kind of a relief of a Phoenician ship. This might have been kind of the ship that Jonah would have rode. What do you ride a ship? You yeah, whatever that verb is. He got on board a ship and he went down. So into the cargo hold, right? We're going to see this theme later. Jonah is really personified more as cargo than anything else, but he goes down into the ship. So thematic movement, a lot of use of the root word yarad, of down. So, but the Lord sent a great wind to the sea. There was a mighty tempest in the sea, that the ship was like to be broken. Then the mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God and cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten it of them. But Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep. We see Jonah's descent getting even worse. Even in the storm of life he's trying to avoid, he has submerged himself. He has sank to the bottom of the ship, and they can't find him. They finally wake him up, and ironically enough, the sailor commands him to rise and call, right? The sailor is actually echoing the very command that God gave Jonah. Arise and go to that great city. Cry against it. Same verbal root, call. It's kara. So, whereas God told Jonah to go up, to arise, to stand, Jonah goes down and down and down. And so, will Jonah finish his sinking? Well, we find out as the wordplay continues on in chapter 2. We know where this goes, right? Jonah actually goes into the ocean, and in his prayer from the belly of the well, he can't imagine himself any further down. In verse 6, I went down to the bottoms of the mountain. Some translation will say to the roots of the mountain. And we'll talk about this imagery in just a second. The earth with her bars was forever, was about me forever. And thou hast brought up my life. So we see he does resurface again, but let's just take a look at what Jonah was envisioning. In the Hebrew mind, this was the view of the world. The world was a dome. The firmament, if you will, they envisioned the world like this, which actually, I guess, in some ways, more true than the flat Earth concept, right? There's a dome to it. There's a roundness to the Earth. But when they talk about Sheol, this kind of the place of the underworld, they envisioned it underneath the Earth, and beneath that, the Earth was standing on these bars, these pillars. So Jonah imagines himself thrown into the sea and sank down beneath the whole earth. Jonah cannot be further down. So we see this thematic development of Jonah sinking. Will Jonah rise again? Well, when the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, again the command is arise. And what does Jonah do? He arose and he went to Nineveh. So Jonah does end up making his way to Nineveh. But I think it's interesting when you look at perhaps we can think of it this way, the way the narrator is describing this in the wordplay, is that when God tells you to go up or to go and do something and you avoid the presence of the Lord, there's only one direction to go, to sink. But even there in the lowest of places, Jonah cries out to God and God pulls him back up. Let's look at another wordplay that's really fascinating and might I add almost comical. It's the verbal root hatil, it's throw. So we first see kind of this jarring reaction of God, that God throws a storm. Sometimes it says send or he moved a storm, but it's different translations. I chose this time the Young's literal translation because they were consistent about translating this verbal root with that kind of cast or throw connotation. So I'm going to say throw. But God threw a storm at the boat, and it was about to break up, right? And so the sailors cried to their gods, and they did what they could, and they throw the cargo into the sea to lighten the vessel, right? And this is the interesting part. Who's down there where the cargo is? Jonah. Remember, we had just seen him go on this descent, really downward trajectory when you escape when you run from the presence of God. And they they narrow it down and they cast lots, and the lots fall on Jonah, and they say, "Hey, we know it's you. What's going on?" And then he tells them who he is and what he's doing, and that it's of course him. And they say, "What have you done?" And does Jonah do anything after that? No. He asked them to lift him up and throw him into the sea. So he doesn't jump over himself. He obviously doesn't have that kind of regard for them. In a way, it's, we see them, their prayer. They said, after they throw him in, they say, "Do not lay on us," or before they throw him in, they ask God to forgive them for his innocent blood. So it's almost like Jonah is saying, "Well, if you want to be saved, you're going to have to murder me, which is going to look bad on you, not me." Jonah seems to have no regard for them. He's behaving more like luggage than a prophet. And he actually asked them to throw him into the sea. And so they lift Jonah up and they threw him into the sea. So Jonah is not quite living up to the reputation of being a prophet of the living God. He's acting like a piece of luggage. So hopefully that wordplay personifies Jonah a little bit more for you, almost, in my opinion, in a comical way. All right, let's look at one last verbal wordplay here in the book of Jonah. We're going to look at two different verbs in the Hebrew, hafak and shuv. Hafak is the verbal root behind the word overthrow that we see here in the three different versions. And as you'll see in the Holman Christian Standard Bible, demolished. Okay, so let's take a step back. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh, so he's finally going. And he began proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. So this word hafak means, you can, depending on context, it literal demolish, like a city to be overturned, right? It's an overthrow or overturned. So, what is meant here? What is God trying to say through Jonah? What kind of turning are we going to witness? A literal brick and mortar turning of a city into rubble and dust? Or are we going to see a different kind of turning? So, as the people respond, the dramatic shift in the tone of Nineveh, this city we expected to greet Jonah with utter violence, right? We see a different kind of response, a turning. So this is our second verbal root here in the purple, shuv. It's commonly translated as repent, but literally turning. So in the NIV, we have kind of the nuances given, let them give up their evil ways, but they're turning from their evil ways and the violence, right? That was the problem we saw with Nineveh prior, and here it shows up again. And one of the interesting things is that the king, in his decree, believes that God might also turn from his anger. So just imagine this scene. Jonah walks into Nineveh expecting to be received in violence. He says the place is going to be overturned, and he's surely hoping for the kind of overturning where he gets to go outside the city, put out a stick with a marshmallow on it, and wait for it to go up in flames like Sodom and Gomorrah. He's wanting the literal demolish kind of turning, doesn't he? But what God has in mind and what the people in Nineveh do, take this turning kind of concept and surprise Jonah. Maybe not God, but it surprises Jonah. For the people receive the message and they act in utter, almost comical levels of religious observance. They fast, they have their livestock fast, they throw sackcloth on themselves, they throw sackcloth on their animals. The king has this decree that nothing and nobody eat or drink, and the animals be covered in sackcloth, and everybody urgently call on God. It's a dramatic turning, and in some way a turning point in our story, as we see God turns from the disaster he had planned for them. So that interesting word that is used here by that's put in the mouth of Jonah by the narrator, because this word could mean to be demolished and it could be to turn. So, as we see, there is verbal play that adds a rich view of the people and the people's response and God's heart. We get a glimpse into God's heart as He turns. We get a glimpse into the people's heart as they turn. And what can happen when people return to God. So as you can see in your study, I know you've probably read the book of Jonah, many times at this point, but it's always good to take a look at different versions and see what else you can see. Because the translators sometimes smooth out things and some of the texture can be lost in terms of wordplay. So take a look at some versions you haven't checked out this week as you read daily the narrative of Jonah and see what else jumps off the page for you. All right, Godspeed.